I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're embracing the gimmicks as I rank the best gimmick boss from each of the Soulsborne games. This topic was suggested by one of my Discord members, Keonius, in my Discord video suggestions chat. I really hope I pronounced that name right. Thank you very much. Now, the definition for a gimmick boss is going to be different depending on who you ask. My definition of a gimmick boss fight is a battle that either revolves around a specific type of gameplay, a battle that can only be completed with a specific mechanic, or a battle that differentiates itself from the norm in a certain way, be it a very noticeable moveset or something else. For example, Demon Souls Dragon God being a stealth fight, High Lord Wolnir from Dark Souls 3 having set weak points with his 3 rings of power, or the Celestial Emissary from Bloodborne being a group boss but only one enemy is actually tied to the health bar, things like that. And next week, tune in as I rank the worst gimmick bosses in each Soulsborne game, because where there are the best, there have to be the worst. Without further ado, the best gimmick bosses from each Soulsborne game, ranked. And be sure to let me know your favorites in the comments. Starting off with Demon Souls, we could genuinely pick from most of the boss roster, as a majority of the encounters have a gimmick of some kind that helps you in your fight drastically. Some notable honorable mentions for me include Maiden Astraea, who doesn't act as a boss, instead sending an NPC to fight you in her stead, and if you slay him, she kills herself. A very fitting end for one of the most tragic figures in the early days of Soulsborne. The Old Hero is my other mention, being a blind creature, and thus when it hears sound, it attacks. In terms of ideas, this is probably the best gimmick in Demon Souls, but in terms of execution, I feel the Old Hero falls a bit short of his potential. I'd really like to see From Software try the blindness gimmick again in a new game with a new boss. No, anybody who knows me or watched my Demon Souls boss ranking knows there was only ever going to be one gimmick boss making the cut, and that is our first spectacle cinematic boss of the series, the Storm King. Fought at the end of the Shrine of Storms in 4-3 at the Storm Altar, this gigantic manta ray flies through the skies while his offspring spears you with crystal pillars. This fight's gimmick is the Storm Ruler, a weapon that can summon the power of the winds and slice through the air. If it's powered up, it can do massive damage to even the largest of creatures. Having a weapon dedicated to defeating a single boss is such a simple gimmick, but I love the atmosphere, the setting, and the almost anime-esque nature of your attacks. Cutting down hordes of the sky beasts that have made your passage through the Shrine of Storms a living hell, and felling an archdemon of a size you can barely comprehend, it makes me feel like a god every single time. The fight was so successful that it spawned multiple successors of the same genre, such as Yhorm the Giant in Dark Souls 3, and to an extent the Divine Dragon from Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Plus another more recent addition from Elden Ring we'll probably be talking about later on this list. Of all the games, Dark Souls for me has the least amount of straight-up gimmick bosses. Sure, we have the obvious, like the Bed of Chaos and the platforming, maybe the Moonlight Butterfly and how it can only be damaged by most builds when it lands, or maybe Gwendolyn and his ever-expanding arena. So I really had to rack my brain for a solid entry, and as an honorable mention, I'd like to talk about Priscilla and her invisibility. I find her fight a little bit too easy for the point in the game you reach her, something they rectified with Sister Fried in Dark Souls 3, but I really love the invisibility gimmick and how you have to actually follow her footsteps in the snow to catch her. Ultimately, I went a bit left field here and decided on the Belfry Gargoyles. Now, I don't inherently consider gank fights, which is the terminology for a fight with 2 or more enemies, to be a gimmick. However, the way the Belfry Gargoyles presents their second gargoyle to me is a cool momentary gimmick that feels fluid in the heat of battle, and everyone remembers it. You see, after you get the first gargoyle down to around half health, the second gargoyle awakens and flies down. This one is also already at half health, easing the player into the concept of a multiple enemy fight, and likely giving you a good jump scare or two in the process. Now, the idea of introducing a second enemy midway through the battle is something From Software have continuously played with moving forwards. Just look at the Four Kings as a prime example from this game, but the Belfry Gargoyles did it first. Yes, the Man-Eaters from Demon's Souls technically did it before them, but the AI was awful, and you know what, I feel like being revisionist for the sake of being revisionist, let's go. Honestly, I have to ask, what are your guys' favorite Dark Souls gimmick bosses? I'd like to see what you consider gimmicks in this boss roster, because this was the hardest entry for me to pick. If I can just take a moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and now I'm back from summer break, I know we can do it. Look at how many of you aren't subscribed. So be sure to parry that subscribe button for more gaming countdowns every Wednesday and Saturday. Back to the video. Dark Souls 2 has such a vast roster of fights to pick from, and there are a few rewarding gimmicks here and there. The Lost Sinners arena gimmick, where you need to find the Bastille key so you can light the torches in her boss arena lest you forfeit your ability to lock on, is pretty notable. Perhaps I could choose Alana the Squalid Queen, as she's the only boss in the game who has a summoner-based moveset, with an RNG that can have you fighting skeletons, Velstadt, or the pigs from Majula. Maybe the Executioner's Chariot, where you have to actively make your way around the arena, dodging the chariot to reach a lever that will ultimately allow you to fight the horse head-on. But no, let's be real, there's one very clear winner when I think of gimmick fights in Dark Souls 2, and it's likely the one you're all picturing. The final boss of Ilium Lois, the Burnt Ivory King, is the best gimmick fight in Dark Souls 2. The battle is split into two phases, the War and the Burnt Ivory King himself, and in the War phase, you have to fight off waves upon waves of charred Lois Knights until the king reveals himself, and this phase changes depending on your work in the DLC. If you went and saved the 3 Lois Knights from around Ilium Lois, they'll join you in the fight and help seal the portals to stop more enemies from pouring in. So you can effectively choose the difficulty of this battle. If you bring 1 knight in, you can seal 1 portal, but 2 will remain open. If you bring 2 knights in, you can seal 2 portals and 1 will remain open. If you bring 3 knights in, all of the portals are sealed, and if you bring all 4 knights in, as 1 knight is always with you regardless of if you've saved any of the other 3, you'll also have a helpful helper when fighting the king. This is a concept that is actually touched upon again in Elden Ring, with General Radahn and the way they handle summons in that fight. But here I think it really emphasizes the climactic and grand nature of the fight, making the Burnt Ivory King's appearance and subsequent battle all the more intense. So Bloodborne has 4 gimmick bosses from the main game that I counted out, and honestly, none of them are particularly great. So rather than talk about my favorite fight of the 4, I'm going to talk about the gimmick that I feel has the most potential in case From Software ever wants to revisit the concept. So to everybody's shock, let's talk about the Witches of Hemwick. The Witches gimmick is that the 2 bosses are both invisible to the player, only able to be seen by their red lantern light or by getting close to them. When one of them is slain, the other will reveal itself, but you can run into either witch from the start of the fight. You'll know you're hitting the second witch if the health bar doesn't go down. At this point, one of the witches can then revive the other after a certain period of time, all the while spawning in evil shade demons to pursue you around the arena. And for a first-time player, this is sure to cause some confusion, which I think is exactly what From Software wanted. The reality is that a puzzle boss like this is never going to reach the heights of bigger bosses in the game, because most people, and I'll admit myself included, enjoy bosses that test your combat skills. So even though I'm very low on the Witches of Hemwick as a boss fight, I can really respect the gimmick and the vision of the developers. If the second witch didn't spam their magic quite as much, or perhaps if once the first witch goes down, the second has a more active movement moveset, making them the main threat instead of the shades, while maybe buffing their HP so they can last a bit longer, I think that would be pretty fun. It may be a bit camp, but I'd have loved to see the witches flying around. Maybe not on like a broom, but with their magic, their mobility could have been more interesting than simply teleporting. Still, what we got had a lot of thought put into it, and of all the gimmicks in Bloodborne, it leads to a pretty simple fight, and sometimes that's all I really want. Moving on to Dark Souls 3, we have a couple potential options. From the Deacons of the Deep, who focus on a crowd control style fight similar to the Celestial Emissary, but with more focus on shifting the weak point between the various enemies, to High Lord Walnir and his Rings of Power that I have a massive soft spot for. Instead though, I decided to pick a boss whose main gimmick is baked into their moveset. Now this may be a stretch, but hear me out. I consider the twin princes Lorien and Lothric to be a gimmick fight. Lorien's entire moveset in both phases revolves around his ability to teleport. The man does not do anything without first launching his body through time and space to nothing personal kid you from behind. You can lock onto him to keep your camera tracking the boss, but you still have to adapt to a moveset where he can appear from anywhere, anytime. And it somehow makes for one of the most engaging fights in Dark Souls 3. Then, when Phase 2 hits, we have the gimmick taken from the Witches of Hemwick, where if Lorien falls, Lothric is able to revive him. Yet your goal is to kill Lothric before he can do this. The fact that you can hit Lothric while he's on the back of his brother if your positioning is good makes this fight extremely dynamic. It's such a unique battle with mechanics that we haven't seen anywhere else in the series, and combined with a moveset that revolves around a mechanic that many would describe as gimmicky in other contexts, I genuinely feel this fight deserves Dark Souls 3's spot on this list. Gimmicks don't have to be all-encompassing after all. That being said, if Lorien only teleported for like one of his moves, I wouldn't count it. But since he teleports for like every move, come on now. It's just fun for me, man. And following on from the ideology of my last entry, for Sekiro, I'm nominating Great Shinobi Owl as this game's gimmick fight, because look, literally, it's either this, the folding screen monkeys by default, or maybe the Divine Dragon, and I know which fight I'd like to talk about in this video. So why do I consider the Great Shinobi Owl a gimmick fight? Well, he's the only character in the game who is able to basically mirror the moveset of Wolf himself. We fight as a shinobi, utilizing our shinobi tools, prosthetics, and various items to bring us the victory. And Great Shinobi Owl does the exact same thing, from shuriken to firecrackers, poison to anti-healing orbs, begging for his life and subverting the honorable trope that many of the fights have had up to this point, the Mikiri counter, all to this most disturbing of music tracks that highlights the grimy nature of Owl's deceit. I love when video games force the player to face an opponent that mirrors themselves. Dante vs. Virgil in Devil May Cry 3, Link vs. Dark Link in Ocarina of Time, Samus vs. the SAX in Metroid Fusion. This is the fight that gives me those feelings in Sekiro. Sure, Owlfather is the harder battle, but as I explained in my Sekiro boss rankings a few months ago, Great Shinobi Owl feels like he has more character to him, more malice inside. And that is more intriguing to me, and is what keeps me coming back for more. Ironically, this is a gimmick From Software took to heart in Elden Ring a little too literally with the Mimic tier. I prefer the way it's done in Sekiro. Having similar movesets is always more entertaining than having the exact same moveset, as it allows for little surprises here and there. Now, if Great Shinobi Owl broke out some of the Senpo sugars, then I'd be absolutely raving. I've alluded to it across the video, but I knew from the moment I chose this idea that I wanted to highlight Elden Ring's Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, because I firmly believe that From Software finally nailed the perfect balance when it came to their big weapon gimmick fights. The Storm King was iconic, and Yhorm was fun but failed to bring any challenge. The Divine Dragon was a set piece, but Rykard manages to both be a fight that allows you to wield a gigantic weapon that slices through the air, while also being a tough battle with an extremely diverse moveset. Phase 1, I've gone on record saying I've struggled with the God-Devouring Serpent's grab attack that scoops me up and damages me beyond belief, and the way you have to manage your positioning to avoid getting caught between the lava beneath the snake and the walls of the arena is really fun. Of course though, Phase 2 is why this boss is so beloved. From that horrifying cutscene where Rykard unsheaths his sword from his throat, to the cheesy voice acting followed by sword slams and hellfire raining down upon you. When Rykard summons his strongest magic and bears down skulls from the sky to explode before charging up for a massive fiery burst, reminiscent of Ludwig's Holy Blade Slam, you know you're having a good time. All the while, you're doing insane damage with your special Serpent Hunter sword, and unlike Yhorm where you had to use the combat art to do damage, here every move has the Wind Slice property. You can use the entire moveset of the Serpent Hunter, and even go to the Round Table Hold and upgrade it, giving you so much more to play with for this full fight. Nothing felt better than charging up a heavy attack that stunned the Serpent into a loop in the first phase. And nothing feels more amazing than cutting through the arena and slaying a gigantic beast of epic proportions, set to a truly blasphemous OST that has me hyped every time I enter. Rykard is so deserving of recognition as the best gimmick boss of Elden Ring, and I couldn't be more proud. And that's my list. Which gimmick bosses from each game are your favorites? And do you have any thoughts on the picks I chose? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on my future content. Next week, it's the worst gimmick bosses from each game as I flip the script. Looking forward to roasting a few fights. My socials are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter or my Blue Sky if you have it. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon, you guys are awesome. Thank you for another month of support. There is a baby crying outside, so I'm gonna end this video now. See you guys next time. Adios!